I'm making this video to help people who might be trying to assemble, or disassemble first of all, the Lockheed master cylinder, brake cylinder on a Series 2. I've not found very much on YouTube that gives the information, and various forums give conflicting information. I've spoken to an awful lot of people and gone around the houses trying to find information. And what I'm putting forward now is just some information. It's not advice, it's not guidance. I'm not a professional engineer, so you shouldn't rely on anything if you're concerned from a safety point of view. Go to a professional to maybe get it completely rebuilt or buy a new one. But if you are a competent do-it-yourselfer and you are intrigued as to why this appears to be difficult when in reality it's not that difficult, perhaps this will help you. You can get various schematics that show the layout. That's all very well, but often when you're taking it apart, the layout doesn't seem to bear any resemblance at all to the reality. So what I thought I'd do is to lay it out here as you would find it when you disassemble it. So I've laid it out in the same order here, and what you can see is there are a number of parts. So the first thing I would advise doing is don't do this in the garage, in a dirty garage floor or workbench. Some of the parts are very tiny and can easily fall away. And what you really want to do is to make certain that you're not getting any dirt or contamination. It's okay being a little bit dirty when you're disassembling it, but when you're reassembling it, you really must be scrupulously clean and make absolutely certain you're not getting any particulate matter stuck in the various areas where it can lodge and perhaps affect the safety of the braking system. It is, after all, the one element on the car you really do want to make certain is working correctly. When you buy the parts, you can't get many of these parts, from what I've seen, are still available. You can either buy the complete body, which is the body element there, or you buy a small kit, and the kit comprises of those parts. It doesn't come with the red rubber grease, which in my view is essential to use, so you'll have to buy that separately. And invariably you get just 9 components that come with it: the retainer, the main cup, piston washer, secondary cup, seal, boot. And then for the piston you get the 2 seals, the little cup seal and the ring seal and the gasket. They're the only parts that you seem to be able to get as replacement parts. What you do if you therefore drop or break any of the other parts is you're stuck with the issue of having to buy a completely new unit, which are about £150, £160 an expensive solution perhaps. Anyway, the parts they give you are the main parts you need to give it what I would call the service repair. It doesn't give you enough parts to do any more of a repair, but there are the main components. There are 9 components that come in a conventional kit. You might also get the rubber seal on the diaphragm if you order the diaphragm kit, and I'll speak about that in a moment. So if you do order it and you want the rubber diaphragm, you have to order that as part of the diaphragm kit to go with the brake seal kit as one unit. The 9 components I've shown here on my further exploded diagram, marked in yellow, so you can see where they go. They are variously spread about. Most of them go onto the piston, and the other ones go on the little piston that sits at the other end. When you're disassembling this, although it looks as if it's a complete assortment of parts, you tend to do it, in my view, in 3 directions. If I can just pick up a pointer and show you without shaking the camera too much. First of all, you want to remove these items, which is the inlet and outlet. They're simply bolt on. Then you can either approach it from this end, which is where you would get to the main piston and spring unit, or you can approach it from that end, which is where you would get to the diaphragm and the housing. In my view, you start first of all with removing those 2 items. Be careful, they've got 2 little copper gaskets either side. So you can take off first of all the inlet one, and then you take off the outlet one. Again, the outlet, when you're doing that, do watch for this item, which is a little spring with a trap valve assembly that sits on the top. This just fits in here and is a simple push-in fit, and it rests on a little ridge that you can just see down there. On one of the diagrams I saw that there was a washer that goes in there, but I'd never had a washer in my one when I disassembled it, and I don't need it because the actual circumference or diameter of the spring is sufficient to sit on that little ledge, and you may or may not have a washer in that. but do be careful when you're taking this out. First of all, don't drop the little copper gasket that you want to retain, and don't drop that, because in it is a tiny little collar, metal collar, that easily drops out. If it drops on the floor and bounces, you might not even realise it was in there. So do be careful with that. It's got a central hole that needs to be cleared out carefully. Don't go pushing down a needle or anything like that. Just be careful how you remove that. You don't want to make the size any different. And don't drop the little metal collar that sits within it here. So first of all, you're removing this, then you're removing that. My recommendation then is to go for removing, sorry about the camera shake, holding it in one hand, go to removing the diaphragm. You start at this end, and although I've shown this disassembled with the filter case out aside and the filter inside, don't start with that. Start with the 5 screws that are around here. They're just a simple screw fit. They go through then this gasket here, through the housing of the valve housing, and bolt straight on. If you take that off by undoing those 5 screws, that comes off as a separate item. That comes off as the diaphragm, which you may or may not need to replace. If you're going for the diaphragm repair kit, you can get that. That just pushes over this plastic diaphragm support. And I'll just pick this up to show you here that the diaphragm support is a simple push-in that goes that way around. I won't disassemble it now, but you can just see that it is as simple just to push in there. I'll put that back. When you do come to take off the valve cover, none of this is exposed. I've exposed this because there's a filter inside here and a filter cover. That filter cover again just contains the filter like that, and that just pops over the top like that, and it's a simple clip-in fit. So that just pushes down. So to separate it out, you just prise it off. There's just get a little edge of a screwdriver in between the final edge here, and you can just see that it's a little clip fit that just sits over the top. So that's the easy way to get that off. The only reason you'd want to do that is if that filter was blocked at all. You can clean the filter up just by soap and water and gentle brushing. It is quite rigid. You're not going to damage it, I don't think. Well, I certainly haven't damaged it. And inside here there's a little Sorbo rubber washer that completes the seal. So again, you don't want to drop that. This has got a little assembly on it, which is a spring with a valve. The spring and valve cap, just want to make certain that's free and not blocked in any way. But other than that, there's not a lot you have to do with it. As I say, you may or may not replace the rubber gasket if you wanted to. That is further disassembly by removing these 2 screws that sit here and here. Those 2 screws are easily removed, and behind it you'll find this gasket sits. This gasket is part of the replacement repair kit and can be replaced when you come to reassemble. You see I've marked it here. The other thing you'll see is the piston, which sits in that little hole here. So if I pick this up, you can see that the piston sits in the centre there. You just want to make certain that that valve body is clear. In order to get that piston out, the way to do that is to gain access through this top hole here, and with a blunt-ended screwdriver to push it back so that the piston comes out that way, so it's just poking out, and then you can just hold it with your fingers and pull it out. You'll see that that piston, excuse me, that piston has 2 seals. Again, they're just a simple pushover and pull off. When you remove them, there's a seal ring that goes on that side, on the left-hand side, and a cup that goes on the right-hand side. They're the 2 items that appear here. So that little cup, that piston cup, if I can just hold it up here, you can see that it's got an inner and outer edge to it. The cup side faces inside. So as you can see, I've assembled it here. You can see which way around the cup goes on the piston. So that's really disassembled quite straightforwardly. The 2 inlets and outlets and the diaphragm. Now you come to the bit that's traditionally held to be the complicated bit. And it is, all you have to do is just take your time. And you can find that through corrosion or retention of gunk, it's stuck in firmly, which makes life somewhat difficult. there are a number of ways suggested for taking it out, and what I'm talking about taking out is the piston. This is the inner piston. It's this item here. This inner piston is what you're trying to remove. And what you do is to start at this end by first of all removing the rubber boot, which you can see here. And then you'll see that there's a spiral lock circlip that's connected to the end of the piston here. So if I can just point to here, that's where it actually clips round. And before that, there is a spring and a spring retainer. Now that's a little bit difficult to get off in my opinion, and there is a little trick to it which I'll just perhaps show you in a moment. When you do take the cup off and the spring off, you then come to a circlip, and the circlip is easily removed with a circlip pliers. It's just a compression plier, but to do that you have to push the body of the piston right down, otherwise you can't get the circlip pliers in there. So once you have removed the spring, the spiral lock circlip, the spring and the spring retainer, then push the piston down as far as it can go, and then you can get that off. Then you're left with this sitting within the body, and this is traditionally what is very difficult for people to get out. Various suggestions, I've tried all of them. Compressed air is what is typically recommended, but to get the compressed air you have to block up those two inlets, and then you have to block up or hold or retain that inlet. Now that gives you nowhere to put the air in. So what I've found works possibly is taking the piston out and injecting the compressed air in that direction, keeping those two blocked up. You can either block it by clamping those two fittings off and putting those back in and clamping them off with tube clamps, or I got hold also from a supplier of components for compressed air industry, the little end cap here like this, which just gives you an easy way of just screwing those in to seal it there. So whichever way you do it, that's the way of doing compressed air. I personally didn't find it worked. The reason it didn't work with me is that the person who'd replaced the seals earlier, and it was a professional garage who did it, had put my seals in round the wrong way. I now discover having disassembled it, and therefore I didn't ever have a really complete seal, and the compressed air just whizzed through and bypassed it. What I did try then was trying to flick the piston backwards and forwards in here. If you can imagine the piston sticking out this end, it's on a spring still, but if you hold it upside down, that's to say with the piston pointing downwards, and you ping the piston back in, the force of gravity and the force of the spring gradually goes bang, 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 and gradually eases out these items, because this is what is gripping it. This has got a rubber seal around it. This is the rubber seal that goes around it, and that gets stuck in, either because there's corrosion at this far end here, in here, or it's just got, stuck over the time. You can, if you're patient, just tap, 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 and spring, 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 and it will come out, but be prepared to devote about an hour of your life to it. Another suggestion that works that I came up with, and I also found that J&L Classics of Rotherham, who've been extremely helpful in giving me some advice and commentary on this, use this system, which I can just show you here, which is to use a raw eye bolt. Now that, happily, if you get the right size, and I think that was an M6, that will fit inside the piston. I'll just try and get my wife to hold the camera a minute. Lucy, you can just come and hold the camera. Sorry about the delay. Just take that. Right, I don't know, hopefully here. What I'm suggesting here is that fits in to the end here. So what you're trying to do is to put that in, screw that up, and that then gives you enough hold of that to be able to pull it back out of the piston, because it's sitting inside the body here. So that gives you enough. So if you do that, and in order to decompress it, because you don't want that stuck in clearly, you'll have to loosen it off and then just push back so that the end nut gradually goes back down. So when you're screwing that in, I'm sure you've all used these, you get them in most DIY stores, it gradually expands out. As you can see, that expanding out. and it will then grip inside here. You can see already it's too big to go back in now. That will hold it. What you then do is to hold that with a bar going through it in that way, support it so that the whole of your cylinder is in effect hanging down off it like that, and you can then bang that down. That works quite satisfactorily. An alternative is, and various people recommend it, and you can take your choice or not, is to, when that end is sticking out of here, if you can imagine that there, you can grip that in soft jaw pliers or wooden, soft jaw vise, bench vise, or a wooden vise. You can grip that quite tight. It is robust, but you do want to be careful you're not going to mark that. It's important not to mark this at all. You want this to be corrosion free, and you want it to be free of all marks and imperfections. But if you grip that, you can then bang it off again, as I say. That would be sticking out here in effect, if you can imagine that sticking out there. And what you're going to do is to grip that end as it's sticking out and bang that backwards down here. Put a block of wood across here as you're hitting. You don't want to hit the face of that with a hammer, but you want to use a fairly heavy hammer to do that and grip that. You might want to protect that end with a piece of cloth as you're doing it in the vise, but be prepared for it to slip out of the vise time and time. But each time you do it, it will gradually come out. But that is the bit that most people find difficult. The other bit that people find difficult is the removal of this Spiralox circlip. Difficult to see how you get that off. It sits here on the end, and obviously you can't get that over at the moment because it's too big. But what again I found is possible to do is just getting an ordinary domestic needle, and you can just separate that. I don't know if you can see here. So a domestic needle separates it quite nicely. If you get your thumbnail under it, you can then see there's the end of it. Hopefully, can you see that that's the end of it there? And that then allows you to spin it onto here. So once you've got that on, you can then spin that round, as you can see I'm doing here, and it spins back on. But you'll only get it off and you'll only get it back on if you separate it first with a needle, in my view. So we now come to having removed the Spiralox that I just described. The end cap is difficult to get off because the spring wants to keep pushing it back up here. So if you can imagine this is now sitting inside and the piston is sticking up through here, it's still attached to the Spiralox, and this spring is actually really quite tight. And if you're trying to hold that down and then you're also trying to put a pin in to get the Spiralox out, it makes life a nightmare. I came up with these devices, which are just made out of coat hanger wire. And all you want to do with those, if you make those up yourself out of coat hanger wire, is just to slide one end through there and then clip it over there. So what that's doing is holding that side down. And if you do the same thing with here, again I can come around here, clip that through there and hold that down there. That then has the shaft, this shaft inside, sticking right up, and you can easily get to the Spiralox without having to balance everything in two hands and so on and so forth. So once you've removed your Spiralox using the pin technique and having held it down with those, you can then remove those. They just pop out. Remove that one, that just pops out, and then the end cap comes out and the spring comes out. You're then at the circlip stage. When you look down here, you'll see that the circlip is sitting inside that groove here. Don't know if you can catch the groove here. So what you want to do is to push the piston back down as far as it will go, and then you can get your circlip pliers in alongside the little stub of the piston and squeeze it in and lift that out. Then that's giving you access to the piston. The piston comes out, and what you will find is you can't get it any further. So that's when you either need to keep banging and pulling, or using that technique, or putting things to hold the bungs together and blowing compressed air in. It will take time, but it will eventually come out. And what you come out with is that unit. And that is the unit you're seeking to get to, because it's got here, first of all, an outer bearing. It's then got the secondary cup, as it's called. It's then got the inner bearing. These are the main components that get worn, and what happens is that the rubber ring that sits around here, like that rubber ring perishes over time. It doesn't necessarily perish over time. It can delaminate instantly you put it in. Here's one I did earlier, so to speak, and you can see that this is the one that is worn. You can see probably the tattered edge to it, and the tattered edge here when I came to disassemble it for a second time because I wasn't convinced I'd done it correctly. This has actually been shaved off the end all the way around, and the reason it's done that, I can now discover, is that it catched just on where the circlip goes in here, and I also hadn't fully cleaned and removed all the surface muck that had got here. So scrupulously clean all this and make certain there's no catches here as you're doing that, so it's absolutely smooth. If there are any pits or holes through anodic corrosion here, or any areas of rust surface build up through cathodic corrosion, you will have to replace this, I'm afraid. You cannot afford to have any pits or any holes or any corrosion on here. You can try very gently removing it with a very fine abrasive, but you don't want to scratch that surface either. You also want to make certain that these are sound and assembled in this direction. Let me just show you here. There is some dispute and debate on the internet as to how this goes, but from everything I now know, it goes with that face and the inner cup goes that way round. This one is the secondary bearing, and the concave, the inner face, goes that way round. So you've got the concave side of both fitting towards that end of the piston, and that then clamps that off and holds it all together as one unit. So that's the unit you're seeking to repair, and that comes with the seal that's here and the secondary cup that's here. They're the two items. You can't, as far as I can find, buy these plastic pieces at all. So if they're knackered, I'm afraid you're down to struggling. You then come down to the main cup, which is at this end, and behind the main cup you might just be able to see that there is this little piston washer. That piston washer comes in the set, as does the main cup. And again, the main cup goes with the concave face, again pointing towards that end. To get to that, you have to remove this retainer. Now this retainer comes as part of the kit, but it's also firmly stuck on here. It is, however, only a fit that's pushed on. It goes on with a click. If you look at the inner face here, you can see that there's little nodules where it clicks on. I won't take this off now just at the moment, I haven't got time, but to get this off, just put a flat-faced metal ruler or a metal edge under here on both sides and just tap on here. So if you support it by putting something either side, if you can imagine that going either side, something there and something there, so it's hanging on it, and just tap that gently, you'll find that will pop off okay. So you want to replace the piston retainer, the main cup and the end plastic retainer, and that gives you all that unit then completely. There's nothing else you have to do. The spring is what comes at the far end. That's got another metal retainer, and that's got a ridge end to it, and the ridge sits at the end of here. So that acts as the blocking piece for that spring when you're coming to reassemble it. And finally, you've got the end lever. The end lever isn't sided, so you can put it in either way, but you have to be a little careful when you're putting that in because it has to engage with the slot that's at the very bottom. And the way I found to do that was to put it here and just hold it, and let it slide down gently, and as it slides down, there, just hear it slide down, you'll find that it will drop and bed itself into the correct position. So you probably can't see too well because I haven't got the bright enough light to show you, but it's right at the end and you want to get that in first. You can then feed that unit in, so I've put that there. That then is attached to the spring and can be fed in Make certain that's over there. That then gets fed in here, and it will go down and just stop at a stopping point before it gets to the far end. This plate, the lever plate, does go backwards and forwards, and it's activated by the piston lever, that piston lever that sits in there. So it will go backwards and forwards, but so when you're putting it in, you want to make certain it doesn't drop out of position. It's still got the tag pointing down. That goes in, and it slowly goes in, but you obviously want to make certain that you've got the new rubber seal going around here, and when it goes in, you want to put it in so that it is lubricated. And to lubricate it, you want to lubricate all of that component with red rubber grease. It's essential, in my view, to use red rubber grease. I've tried using just ordinary brake fluid, as is conventionally done, and it doesn't really work. Red rubber grease gives you a much better lubrication. So red rubber grease all this, the piston and the rubber ring before you put the rubber ring on, and lubricate that. And then very gradually and slowly, don't force it in, very gradually and slowly ease it in, because you don't want to tear or break the edges of either the main cup or the secondary cup, because that's also going to be rubbing on the piston as it goes in. You don't want to damage that as it goes through there. So you do want to make certain that you've got the retainer sitting at the end of the spring and that you've got the lever in there before you're reassembling it. That really is all that's involved in the process that I've found. You've got to take your time with it. When you're reassembling it again, make certain that the main piston and the bearings all go in gently, well lubricated. Refit the circlip. Once you've refitted the circlip, put the spring with the spring retainer on top. Use the two clips that I suggested to hold it in. Replace the spiral lock circlip, and then of course the rubber boot goes on. Rubber boot's got a little drain hole in it. That seems to go at the bottom. So that really concludes my suggestion of how you might find life a bit easier to do it. I hope it works for you. I've disassembled and reassembled a few times, and I thought, having done it now, it's well worth trying to put something together that might just help other people, because I've found other people who've generously put things on YouTube have been very useful to me. So Chris Vine particularly has got a wonderful website. I don't know how he's had the time to build the car and do the website all at the same time. And he's done a very interesting